Hello, hello, lovelies. Welcome to Midnight on Call. I'm your host, MD Who, and the doctor is in. Thank you so much for the viewers that we have joining us this evening. Now, today we are picking up on part 2 of Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. Now, where we last left off, if you have forgotten, Rip Van Winkle managed to wander into the mountains with his dog and came across these tiny little men that were bowling in the mountains. They each had a flagon of this very strange liquor, and he had a flagon himself and fell asleep. And when he woke up, his gun was missing, replaced with a rusty pistol, and his dog He determined to revisit the scene of the last evening's gamble, and, if he met with any of the party, to demand his dog and gun. As he rose to walk, he found himself stiff in his usual activity. These mountain beds do not agree with me, thought Rip, and if this frolic should lay me up with a fit of rheumatism, I shall have less time with Dame Van Winkle. But with some difficulty he got down into the glen. He found the gully up which he and his companion had ascended the preceding evening, but to his astonishment a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock and filling the gully. He, however, made shift, working his toilsome way through the thickets of birch, sassafras, and witch hazel, and sometimes tripped up to entangled by the wild grapevines that twisted their coils or tendrils from tree to tree and spread the kind of network in his path. At length he reached to where the ravine had opened later, but no traces of such opening remained. The rocks presented a high, impenetrable wall over which the torrent came rumbling in a sheet of feathery foam and fell into a broad, deep basin, black from the shadows of the surrounding forest. Here, then, poor Rip was brought to a stand. He again called and whistled after his dog. He was only answered by the cawing of a flock of idle crows sporting high in the air above a dry tree that overhung a sandy precipice, in which, secure in their elevation, seemed to look down and scoff at the poor man's perplexities. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished for want of his breakfast. He grieved to give up his dog and gun. He dreaded to meet his wife, but it would not do to starve among the mountains. Shouldering the rusty flintlock, and with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. As he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none whom he knew, which somewhat surprised him, for he had thought himself acquainted with everyone in the country around. Their dress, too, was of a different fashion from that to which he was accustomed. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise, and whenever they cast their eyes upon him, invariably stroked their chins. The constant recurrence of this gesture induced Rip involuntarily to do the same when, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long. He had now entered the skirts of the village. A troop of strange children ran at his heels, hooting after him and pointing at his gray beard. The dogs, too, not one of which he recognized for his old acquaintance, barked at him as he passed. The very village was altered. It was larger and more populous. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been his familiar haunts had disappeared. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. He began to doubt whether both he and the world around him were not bewitched. Surely this was his native village, which he had left the day before. There stood the Catskill Mountains. There ran the silver Hudson at a distance. There was every hill and dale precisely as it always had been. Rip was sorely perplexed. That flagon last night, thought he, has addled my poor head sadly. It was with some difficulty that he found the way to his own house, which he approached with silent awe, expecting every moment to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle. He found the house gone hay, the roof fallen in, the windows shattered, and the door off the hinges. A dog that looked like Wolf was skulking about it. Rip called him by the name, but the cur snarled, showed his teeth, and passed on. This was an unkind cut indeed. My very dog, sighed poor Rip, has forgotten me. He entered the house, which, to tell the truth, Dame Van Winkle had always kept in neat order. It was empty, forlorn, and apparently abandoned. This desolateness overcame all his concubinal fears. He called loud. The lonely chambers rang for a moment with his voice, and then all again was silence. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn, but it too was gone. A large, rickety wooden building stood in its place, with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats, and over the door was painted "The Union Hotel" by Jonathan Doolittle. Instead of the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, there now was reared a tall, naked pole with something on the top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag, which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe, but even this was singularly metamorphosed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in a hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, "General Washington." There was, as usual, a crowd of folk about the door, but none that ripped. The very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it instead of the accustomed phlegm and drowsy tranquillity. He looked in vain for the sage Nicholas Vedder, with his broad face, double chin, and fair long pipe, uttering clouds of tobacco smoke instead of idle speeches, or Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, doling forth the contents of an ancient newspaper. In place of these, a lean, bilious-looking fellow with his pockets full of handbills was haranguing vehemently about rights of citizens, elections, members of Congress, liberty, Bunker's Hill 86, and other words which were Babylonish jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. The appearance of Rip, with his long grizzled beard, his rusting fowling piece, his uncouth dress, and an army of women and children at his heels, soon attracted the attention of the tavern. They crowded around him, eyeing him from head to toe with great curiosity. The orator bustled up to him and, drawing him partly aside, inquired on which side he voted. Rip stared in vacant stupidity. Another short but busy little fellow pulled him by the arm and, rising on tiptoe, inquired in his ear whether he was a Federal or a Democrat. Rip was equally at a loss to comprehend the question, when a knowing, self-important old gentleman with a sharp cocked hat made his way through the crowd, putting them to the left and right with his elbows as he passed and planting himself before Van Winkle with one arm akimbo, the other resting on his cane, his keen eyes and sharp hat penetrating, as it were, into his very soul, demanding in an austere tone what gun on his shoulder and a mob at his heels, and whether he meant to breed a riot in this village. "Alas, gentlemen," cried Rip, somewhat dismayed, "I am a poor, quiet man, a native of the place and a loyal subject of the king. God bless him!" Shout burst from the bystanders. "A Tory! A Tory! A spy! A refugee! Hustle him! Away with him!" It was with great difficulty that the self-important man in the cocked hat restored order, and, having assumed a tenfold, demanded again of the unknown therefore and whom he was seeking. The poor man humbly assured him that he meant no harm, but merely came his neighbors who used to keep about the tavern. "Well, who are they? Name them." Rip bethought himself a moment and inquired, "Where's Nicholas Vedder?" Itchy. Eye is itchy. And what happened to my music? Oh dear. That's okay. I never changed over. Silly me. Okay. Rip bethought himself a moment and inquired, "Where's Nicholas Vedder?" I don't think I have music anymore. Oh well. Oh, here we go. Maybe some nice fireplace sounds. Sorry about this, folks. I really feel like there should be some background sounds. Doot, doot, doot. Doot, 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 doot. Okay, have it your way. Rick bethought himself a moment and inquired, "Where's Nicholas Vedder?" There was a silence for a little while, when an old man replied, in a thin, piping voice, "Nicholas Vedder? Why, he is dead and gone these 18 years. There was a wooden tombstone in the churchyard that used to tell all about him, but that's rotten and gone too." "Where's Brom Dutcher?" "Oh, he went off to the army at the beginning of the war. Some say he was killed in the storming of Stony Point. Others say he drowned in a squall at the foot of Antony's Nose." There we go. "I don't know. He never came back again." "Where's Van Bommel, the schoolmaster?" "He went off to the wars too, was a great militia general, and now is in Congress." Rip's heart died away at hearing of these sad changes in his home and friends, and finding himself thus alone in the world. Every answer puzzled him too by treating of such enormous lapses of time, and of matters which he could not understand. War, Congress, Stony Point. He had no courage to ask after any more friends, but cried out in despair, "Does nobody here know Rip Van Winkle?" "Oh, Rip Van Winkle!" exclaimed 2 or 3. "Oh, to be sure, that's Rip Van Winkle yonder, leaning against the tree." Rip looked and beheld a precise counterpart of himself as he went up the mountain, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity and whether he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, The man in the cocked hat demanded who he was and what was his name. "God knows!" exclaimed he, at his wit's end. "I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. No, that somebody else got into my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountains, and they've changed my gun, and everything's changed, and I'm changed, and I can't tell what's my name or who I am." The bystanders began now to look at each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. There was a whisper also about securing the gun and keeping the old fellow from doing mischief, at the very suggestion of which the self-important man in the cocked hat retired with some precipitation. At this critical moment, a fresh, comely woman pressed through the throng to get a peep at the grey-bearded man, chubby child in her arms, who, frightened at his looks, began to cry. "Hush, Rip," cried she. "Hush, you little fool. The old man won't hurt you." The name of the child, the air of the mother, the tone of her voice, all awakened a train of recollections in him. "What is your name, my good woman?" asked he. Judith Garnier." "And your father's name?" "Ah, poor man, Rip Van Winkle was his name. But it's 20 years since he went away from home with his gun, and never has been heard of since. His dog came home without him, but whether he shot himself or was carried away by Indians, no one can tell. I was then but a little girl." Rip had but one more question to ask, but he put it with a faltering voice. "Where is your mother?" "Oh, she too had died a short time since. She broke a blood vessel in a fit of passion at a New England peddler." There was a drop of comfort, at least, in this intelligence. The honest man could contain himself no longer. He caught his daughter and her child in his arms. "I am your father," cried he. "Young Rip Van Winkle once, old Rip Van Winkle now. Does nobody—" All stood amazed until an old woman, tottering out from among the crowd, put her hand to her brow and peering under it in his face for a moment, exclaimed, "Sure enough, it is Rip Van Winkle. It is himself. Welcome home again, old neighbor. Why, where have you been these 20 long years?" Rip's story was soon told, for the whole 20 years had been to him but as one night. The neighbors stared when they heard it. Some were seen to wink at each other and put their tongues in their cheeks, and the self-important man in the cocked hat, who, when the alarm was over, had returned to the field, screwed down the corners of his mouth and shook his head, upon which there was a general shaking of the head throughout the assemblage. It was determined, however, to take the opinion of old Peter Vanderdonk, who was seen slowly advancing up the road. He was a descendant of the historian of that province. Peter was the most ancient inhabitant of the village, and well versed in all the wonderful events and traditions of the neighborhood. He recollected Rip at once, and corroborated his story in the most satisfactory manner. He assured the company that it was a fact, handed down from his ancestor the historian, that the Catskill Mound strange beings, that it was affirmed that the great Henrik Hudson, the first discoverer of the river and country, kept a kind of vigil there every 20 years, with his crew of the Half Moon being permitted in this way to revisit the scenes of his enterprise and keep a guardian eye upon the river and the great city called by his name. That his father had once seen them in their old Dutch dresses, playing at ninepins in a hollow of the mountain, and that he himself had heard one summer afternoon the sound of their balls like distant peals of thunder. To make a long story short, the company broke up and returned to the more important concerns of the election. Rip's daughter took him home to live with her, She had a snug, well-furnished house, and stout, cheery farmer for a husband, recollected for one of the urchins who used to climb upon his back, as to Rip's son and heir, who was the ditto of himself, seen leaning against the tree. He was employed to work on the farm, but evinced a hereditary disposition to attend to anything else but his own business. Rip now resumed his old walks and habits. He soon found many of his former cronies, though all the rather worse for the wear and tear of time, and preferred making friends among the rising generation, with whom he soon grew into great favor. Having nothing to do at home, and being arrived at that happy age where a man can be idle with impunity, he took his place once more on the bench at the inn door, and was reverenced as one of the patriarchs of the village, and a chronicle of the old times before the war. It was some time before he could get into the regular track of gossip, or could be made to comprehend strange events that had taken place during his torpor. How that there had been a revelation had the bear. Mouth and throat are getting dry. It was some time before he could get into the regular track of gossip, or could be made to comprehend the strange events that had taken place during his torpor. How that there had been a revolutionary war, the yoke of old England, and that instead of being a subject of His Majesty George III, he was now a free citizen of the United States. Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of state and empires made but little impression on him, but there was one species of despotism under which he had long groaned, and that was petticoat government. Happily that was an end, the yoke of matrimony, and could in and out whenever he pleased without dreading the tyranny of Dame Van Winkle. Whenever her name was mentioned, however, he shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, and cast up his eyes, which might pass either for an expression of resignation to his fate, or joy at his deliverance. He used to tell his story to every stranger who arrived at Mr. Doolittle's hotel, every time he told it, which was doubtless owing to his having so recently awaked. It at last settled down precisely to the tale I have related, and not a man, woman, or child in the neighborhood but knew it by heart. Some always pretended to doubt the reality of it, and insisted that Rip's head, and that this was one point on which he always remained flighty. The old Dutch inhabitants, however, almost universally gave it full credit. Even to this day, they never heard a thunderstorm of a summer afternoon about the Catskill, but they say Henrik Hudson and his crew are at their game of ninepins, and it is a common wish of all henpecked husbands in the living and dead, where life hangs heavy on their hands, that they might have a quieting draught out of Rip Van Winkle's flagon. And that, my friends, is the end of that story. Ooh, we didn't even hit 30 minutes. See, last was only 30 minutes. This was only 30 minutes. I really could have probably just had it in one video, one live stream, one stream. But that is what it is. I want to thank all of you for coming, all of you in the future who are listening to this now. It is going to be on the 10th at midnight. That is on a Saturday at midnight, and I'm going to be reading The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe.